So hi everyone, like Raquel was saying, my name is Sarah. My pronouns are she, her. So I am a PhD candidate in clinical psychology at Dalhousie University and also an associate at Lesley Hartman and Associates. So at Lesley Hartman and Associates, I'm a member of the DBT team. So I have been there for about 2.5 years now, or over. I've seen a lot of clients done, 17 DBT groups, I think. So I'm well versed in it. So if you have any questions about DBT, you've come to the right spot. And I'm really excited to chat with everyone today about the Skills for Recovery group that we're going to be offering in collaboration with Eating Disorders Nova Scotia, because I think this kind of fills a need in the community. And I'm really glad that we're able to do that. So we'll get started. It really is kind of, less workshopy, more of a talk, just to really make sure you get all the information. But as I'll discuss with you in a minute, at the end, I'm going to make sure that I do teach a skill associated with DBT and for eating disorders, so that you have, you leave here with something a little bit more than you came with, maybe. So I will get started. So just in terms of an outline today, in terms of what we're going to talk about, we're just going to start talking about, what is dialectical behavior therapy? Lots of people probably haven't heard of that, so I'll give you a bit of an overview. We'll talk about, how does the upcoming Skills for Recovery group kind of fit into dialectical behavior therapy? We'll talk about, what the heck is a dialectic, because you might not have heard that term before. We'll talk about what part of DBT is behavioral, so that B in the acronym. What types of skills are taught? What does group look like? And then, like I said, we'll learn a DBT skill to help with eating disorder symptoms. So there are really, I should mention as well, we put this in at the last minute, Raquel and I, that we're going to really encourage you to kind of send your questions as you go throughout the night, because I know questions can kind of come in our heads and then they'll leave. So feel free to send them whenever, and then I'll answer them kind of towards the end of the presentation. So there's 3 goals for tonight. The first goal is just for everyone to really learn a bit about the DBT model, get an overview of DBT skills for eating disorders, why DBT is relevant. The second goal is to really give you the information you need to decide if you'd like to take part in the Skills for Recovery group. So really, I'm hoping that we give you enough information for you to make an informed choice about whether that group would be a good fit for you. And then, of course, to learn that one DBT skill. So I will just get right into it with what is DBT. So DBT, dialectical behavior therapy, was created by Dr. Marsha Linehan. There she is. So she is a psychologist from the United States, and she really, when she was trying to develop DBT, wanted to create a treatment for individuals who were experiencing emotion dysregulation. So what I mean by that is really finding emotions to be overwhelming, and when they experience emotions, not really knowing, what to do with the emotion, and kind of just riding them out until they dissipated. And so that might be something that some of you kind of, I guess, associate with or kind of connect with. And she also wanted to create a therapy for people who are experiencing behavioral dysregulation. So what that means is, when emotions are high, especially, having a really hard time kind of inhibiting impulses. So, when anger is high, being able to stop ourselves from yelling or lashing out, or when emotion's high, stopping ourselves from engaging in self-harm can be difficult at times. So it's really targeted towards individuals experiencing those types of things. And it's really based in CBT, which you might have heard of, cognitive behavioral therapy, but it also adds in concepts like mindfulness and other evidence-based strategies. And the goal is really to create a life worth living. So we know that part of that is symptom reduction. Lots of people come to treatment saying, I'm having all these symptoms, I don't want them anymore. So we work on that, but we want to move beyond that as well and really work on how can we create a life that has value to you, that you really appreciate and connect with. So the question is, who is DBT for? Who does it work for? So DBT is the gold standard treatment for borderline personality disorder. And borderline personality disorder, or BPD, is really commonly comorbid or commonly seen with eating disorders. So if any of you kind of connect with the diagnosis of BPD, DBT is really the number one treatment for that concern. And it's also been found to help symptoms related to anxiety, depression, PTSD, and eating disorders, which we'll talk about in a minute. But I think that's the really great piece about DBT is it's not meant for just, one particular concern, but it's meant to address lots of different things, which is great because that represents the human experience where we are experiencing, a number of different things at the same time. So DBT as a treatment is really this comprehensive treatment package where it has four components. So it has skills group, so group therapy, individual therapy, phone coaching where clients can access their individual therapist outside of session, and then also consultation team where the DBT therapists meet to really make sure they're delivering the best care possible. So this is what we call, standard DBT, which all four of those components. And so what we're doing in conjunction with Eating Disorders Nova Scotia is really focusing in on one component, which is skills group, which we're going to offer really focusing on eating disorders. So we're going to take the skills that are normally part of DBT group, pick out the ones that are the most relevant to eating disorders, and then provide those. So this is really what we call DBT informed because it is one aspect of the DBT comprehensive treatment program rather than all four components. So I think this group, like I said at the beginning, fills a really important need, but I want to talk about the evidence-based treatments for eating disorders in case everyone's not familiar with that. So CBT is recommended as one of the best treatment options for anorexia, bulimia, for binge eating. And so it has pretty high remission rates. It's a pretty successful treatment. And you'll notice that that is not DBT, it's CBT. But DBT skills are often included in addition to CBT treatments or they're part of CBT treatments. So for example, at the Eating Disorders Clinic here in Nova Scotia, I've done a practical placement there, I know it well. So what they will offer is a treatment-based day treatment program, which includes as part of it a DBT skills group, because we know that DBT skills are really helpful with eating disorders. And then as well with CBT treatments, so for example, the model that's used here in Nova Scotia right now is mostly CBT-T. It's called CBT 10 Sessions for Eating Disorders. And that treatment program also includes DBT skills as part of it. So as basically my take home point here is while DBT isn't, the frontline gold standard treatment for eating disorders, it is often included as part of eating disorder treatment because those skills are so relevant. Now, what we do know about DBT is that it has been found to reduce, binge eating, purging, and weight and shape concerns in terms of research. So we know it's useful. So in terms of just kind of conceptualizing this, then DBT group or the group that we'll be offering is really going to be a great kind of starting place. So if you're someone who is experiencing eating disorder symptoms and you're saying, I'm ready to start treatment, I'm not sure if I want to jump all the way in to challenging everything because eating disorder treatment really is about jumping in the deep end. This is a good place to kind of start to learn some skills to manage your symptoms. And I mean, lots of us, especially individuals with eating disorder symptoms, have symptoms of anxiety or depression or these other things that are showing up. And DBT group is really helpful for those things as well. So what I'll say is kind of this is the starting line for eating disorder treatment, but not necessarily the finish line. So you might not get through the whole group and say, I no longer meet the criteria that would be necessary to get a diagnosis of an eating disorder. You might still meet it, but this would be a really helpful option. If you feel like you're just ready to jump in, do some CBT for eating disorders, which can look like a 20 or 40 weeks of individual therapy, then that's really helpful to notice as well. And I'd be happy to talk at the end if you're interested about other options in terms of how to gain access to those things in the public or private system. All right. So let's talk about DBT. So DBT, we're going to kind of break it down to the D, the B, and the T. So DBT, the D, dialectical. Let's start with that one. So unless you have taken a philosophy class, or done some reading in philosophy, you probably haven't heard this term before tonight. I know I hadn't heard it prior to getting trained in this therapy. And it really is kind of can be a difficult concept to understand. So I will try to illustrate it with some examples. But what dialectical really means is it's a synthesis of opposing positions. So it's really about trying to say, two things can seem to conflict and they can both have truth in them. So, one of the main dialectics in DBT is acceptance on one hand and change on the other. So, a lot of people would say, right up front, aren't acceptance and change kind of inherently conflicting? You know, acceptance is about, being willing to accept the situation and live with it. And change is inherently opposite, saying, I want to change things in my life. I don't want to accept the way things are. So in DBT, we'd say, that's true. And they're both really necessary. So sometimes we need to accept things and sometimes we need to change things. And really importantly, we can't really change things unless we've accepted them first. So DBT skills are built on this dialectic. So we teach skills really focused on acceptance. So we ask questions, and work on things like, how can I accept my urges and my emotions without judgment? How can I learn to tolerate my distress? So actually be willing to kind of sit in some uncomfortable emotions when they make sense, when they fit the situation. But on the other hand, how can I learn to change unhelpful behaviors? How can I learn new responses to my urges, to my emotions, to distressing situations? So trying to recognize that we need both of those sets of skills. So DBT, and I should say dialectics, are really about being flexible, about seeing other perspectives, recognizing there isn't necessarily one truth. And this is pretty relevant to a lot of mental health concerns, but especially eating disorders, where we often see, and you might have experienced this yourself, kind of rigidity in thoughts and feelings and behaviors that accompany eating disorders. That's kind of inherently part of them, especially if we've ever experienced a low BMI as a result of an eating disorder, where rigidity might be especially strong just due to the nature of that. So, how we tend to see it in thoughts is that we see black and white thinking. So, you might have heard this before. It's also called all or nothing thinking, where things are either, all one way or all the other. There's no middle path. So, it's all white, it's all black. There's no gray in the middle of our thinking patterns. So, we might say, this food is good or bad, or this I'm good or bad, or I either succeed or I fail. And that type of thinking is really common, but it can get us into a bit of trouble because it tends to trigger some pretty strong emotions for us. So, for example, if I say, I failed a test versus I didn't do as well as I was hoping to, that's going to trigger some really different emotions. So if I'm a perfectionist and I got 70%, telling myself that's a failure versus telling myself I didn't do as well as I wanted to, that's going to trigger the same emotion, but in a really different intensity. So we want to work on trying to, find that gray, like we said, or the example I gave with, I didn't do as well as I hoped. We can also see kind of black and white thinking with a lot of food rules we have. So we might say, this, I'm allowed to have this food, but not this food. Or I can eat, at this time of day, but not this time. Or in this context, but not this context. And what tends to happen when we have those rigid rules that we feel like we need to stick to is, we're trying to stick to those rules because we think they're helping us accomplish something. But often what happens is we end up breaking them because we're human. And humans aren't meant to be so rigid, especially around kind of food behaviors. And so this can result in some eating disorder behaviors themselves, because when we break our rule, we tend to feel a lot of shame. We feel bad, especially, if we said we weren't going to eat something and we ate that thing. And then it might spark some eating disorder behaviors like purging or exercise, or a behavior that we might feel like we need to punish ourselves. Or on the other hand, if we break our food rule, we have something we said we wouldn't, it might result in a binge. So it really is, these rigidity can result in more trouble than, problems it solves. And then the other way we kind of live in dialectic sometimes in eating disorders is, some people say they have really strong fluctuating intensity of emotion. So they might say, I have two versions of my emotional experience. I can either be, really overwhelmed by my emotions are really strong. Or on the other hand, I can feel like I'm not connected to my emotions at all. I'm kind of numb from my emotions and kind of flopping back and forth between really overwhelming emotions and no emotions at all. So it can feel like, when we're experiencing big emotions, we're kind of living in this scorching desert where it's like just feels excruciating and it's hard to survive, versus when we're not experiencing emotions, we're living in this Arctic. Neither one of those is habitable in the long term. So what we want to do is find an environment that's more livable, a rainforest. Or when we think about black and white thinking, we want to find the gray. And that's really what dialectics are all about. So we talk about that in this treatment because it can be so helpful to develop that flexibility to kind of see the middle path. So that's dialectics. Um, some people, say, I have no idea what that means. I don't understand dialectics, and that's okay. It really does seem to make more sense and start to make more sense as we kind of go through the therapy and as we talk about that. All right. Okay, the next piece here is behavior. So the B in DBT is the same as the B in CBT. So if you are familiar with CBT, if you've done any CBT treatments, and whether that's been for eating disorders or other disorders like anxiety or depression, this might sound pretty familiar to you. So the B stands for behavior, and what we mean by that is DBT focuses on behavioral principles about what is leading to a behavior or what makes it kind of more or less likely to happen. So if you have ever taken an introduction to psychology class, you have probably heard this idea about principles of reinforcement, which really govern human behavior. So you can probably think of examples from your own lives. When you do a behavior and then you get a reward, you're more likely to engage in that behavior again. So reinforcement can be kind of positive or it can be negative. So when it's positive, it means when we do a behavior, we get something good given to us. So what this means, we have the behavior, we have the reward, we're more likely to do that behavior again. So an example might be, if I'm helping my partner with the dishes at night, they might, give me a hug, give me some, positive reinforcement in terms of giving me some compliments or thanking me, some praise. And if I really respond well to that and that is meaningful to me, then I'm probably more likely to help them with the dishes again in the future. Right? So that's pretty simple. My partner might not be giving me praise because they want me to do the dishes again. But that kind of information and that kind of reward really does impact my behavior, whether or not I really recognize it. The other way that reinforcement can show up, which I kind of alluded to before, is with negative reinforcement. So by negative reinforcement, I don't mean, something bad or something uncomfortable. I mean, it's still reinforcing, it's still rewarding, but it's rewarding because something we don't like is taken away. So an example would be we do a behavior, that thing is taken away and I get relief. So I'm more likely to do that behavior again. So it could be, if I'm in the toy store or the supermarket with my child and they are crying and crying and crying, and I feel embarrassed because I can't get my child to stop crying, and I'm, kind of annoyed and my ears might hurt because children crying sometimes hurts. And I give my child a toy and they're happy. I'm probably more likely to give my child the toy again because when I did, the crying stopped and I got that relief. So the reason I'm kind of spending so much time to kind of talking about this with you is because reinforcement principles occur in eating disorders a lot. Eating disorders are thought to be, really high in that negative reinforcement specifically. So that example with the child, where there's something uncomfortable and we do a behavior and it takes that uncomfortable thing away. And so we want to start kind of building awareness around this, whether you do the group or not, just to understand, why is it so hard to stop doing this behavior? If you've ever wondered about that, like, why can't I just stop this? And it's often because we're being reinforced. There's something good that's coming out of it. So, really common example of negative reinforcement in eating disorders specifically would be, if we have a really intense emotion and we binge and that emotion goes away, that's pretty reinforcing. That's a positive experience. Maybe binging has some negative consequences in the long term, but in that moment, it took away that uncomfortable emotional experience. So it's really reinforcing. And we're going to associate binging with, causing that function, allowing us to escape from our emotion. The other way it can show up, or one of the many ways it can show up, is if we're having an urge to engage in an eating disorder behavior, whether that's kind of purging, or maybe it's an urge to weigh ourselves or something like that. Those urges are uncomfortable. Okay, if you think back to a time where you've had an urge to engage in an eating disorder behavior, it doesn't feel good. It's hard to sit with. But when we actually do the behavior, that urge goes away. Right. So if I have an urge to purge and it's feeling uncomfortable to hold it and I decide to purge, I get a little bit of relief. And so I'm more likely maybe to engage in purging again when I experience that uncomfortable urge, because I know it's going to be rewarding and it's going to work. Reinforcement can also be positive in eating disorders. This is something we don't think about as much, but it's most definitely present. So, for example, especially at the beginning of eating disorders, sometimes, although definitely not all the time, eating disorder symptoms and weight loss really don't go hand in hand very often or all the time. So, eating disorder behaviors might lead to weight loss. And if that results in us getting praise from others, we might be more likely to continue those eating disorder behaviors. Or if we aren't really receiving the love and care that we need from our family, but when we show them that we're struggling with our eating disorder, they give us, love and praise, then we're more likely to continue with the eating disorder, even if that's not conscious, because we all need love, we all need affection, we all need care. So, reinforcement, I guess the take home message is really common and it's relevant. And it's something that I encourage you just to start building awareness about, to see if you can kind of notice this, and also help yourself understand, like, this is why it's so hard, for many other reasons, but this is one of them. So, that's the behavioral piece. The next piece here is the therapy piece. So let's talk a bit about that. So again, right, this is the skills only component that I'm referring to, and I'm talking about therapy. I'm not going to touch on the other three components of DBT because that's not relevant for this group. But the therapy piece, at least the group piece, is going to teach 4 sets of skills that help to cope with eating disorder symptoms, as well as just daily life struggles. So these 4 sets of skills are, mindfulness, distress tolerance, emotion regulation, and interpersonal effectiveness. And I'm going to walk through each one of those skills now, and we'll talk about what they are and why they're relevant to eating disorders and why they're useful. Okay, so we'll start with mindfulness. So I'm guessing there is not a person in this Zoom room, if we can call it that, who has not heard of mindfulness, right? It's very big in pop culture. I think, when we think of mindfulness, the first image that comes up for a lot of people is, someone kind of sitting in a rainforest, maybe kind of meditating, looking very calm. And that can be part of mindfulness for sure. But mindfulness is really a lot more broad than that. So, at its core, mindfulness is about intentionally living with awareness in the present moment without judgment. So, really riveting ourselves to now and trying to take away judgments. So, what I mean by that is terms like good or bad, labeling like, whether it's to ourselves or other people, like fat or loser or failure or unlovable, those types of things that we tell ourselves or we tell others. So, really working on removing that and just sticking with the facts. It's also about building awareness of our thoughts, of our feelings, of our behaviors, of our urges. Because a lot of times, sometimes we think, our behaviors come out of nowhere or our urges come out of nowhere. We don't know why things are happening, or we're not plugged in to those things at all. We're not aware of them. And so it's about building that awareness, which is uncomfortable sometimes and really helpful. So I guess that's a myth I want to debunk about mindfulness right away. Is it's not just about being calm and zen. Sometimes it's about, getting in touch with some really uncomfortable things in order to, help meet our needs and help meet our goals. So mindfulness helps us to do a lot of things. One of them is to be present. So a lot of people have the experience. Actually, some of you might be having this experience right now where you're sitting in a meeting. I find this is especially present during COVID versus when we were doing online meetings. And you're, looking at the screen and your mic's on or your volume's on, but you're thinking about other things, right? You're thinking about, what do I have to do tomorrow? Or you're ruminating about something that happened today. And we go through a lot of life like that. And what happens when we do that is we end up kind of missing the present moment, missing what's going on in front of us. And so mindfulness is about really helping us to be present, to be aware, to really engage with life. It's also about experiencing reality as it is. So what that means is really working on, putting aside those judgments and really focusing on the facts. Research has been done on mindfulness. There's actually been quite a bit of research, especially in probably the last 15 years. And what it's really saying is mindfulness helps us to reduce our suffering, reduce the presence of negative emotions, and increase our happiness, which I think are goals that are pretty universal for everyone. And then lastly, mindfulness helps us to increase control of the mind. What I mean by that is mindfulness helps us figure out, what we're paying attention to and how long we pay attention to it. We have more control over that. So this is true for anyone. I know a lot of people might have a diagnosis of ADHD, and if that's the case, this can still be really useful for you, and it can help increase control of the mind, even if it kind of looks different than it might look for other people. So really mindfulness, like I said at the beginning, is about about being zen and meditating, but it's really about kind of learning to observe things, really without judgment. So whether that's our thoughts, our emotions, sounds, our breathing, really just tuning in to one thing at a time, or it's about really throwing ourselves into an activity wholeheartedly and participating. So we can mindfully, brush our teeth, we can mindfully dance or hike or cook or plant or do whatever we want to do. And mindfulness is really about helping us do that. When I talk to people about mindfulness, I tend to find people are in kind of one of two camps. They're either, really on board with mindfulness and they say, I love it, I like this idea, or they think, mindfulness is kind of a load of crap. And so if you're in the kind of skepticism category of wondering about mindfulness, I encourage you to just try and be open to it and give it a try, even if you've tried it before, because it can be really helpful. And it can be really helpful specifically with eating disorder symptoms. So I have a whole list of things about why it's helpful. So I'm going to throw it up on the screen and then we'll walk through it together. So one of the reasons mindfulness really matters with eating disorders is because honing our mindfulness skills actually helps us to catch and observe our urges and emotions. So a lot of times we might experience big emotions and we just don't know what to do with them. And our first instinct is to try and get rid of them. And mindfulness helps us to take more of an observer perspective and learn to really sit with them without changing them, without judging them, which can take a lot of the pressure off and really help us to just kind of sit with our emotions, which is really important for mental health. It can also help us to stop mindless eating. So by mindless eating, what I really mean is when, an example would be like sitting on the couch, watching TV, we have a bowl of chips or popcorn or something, and we're not really paying attention to our eating. And all of a sudden we realize we've kind of eaten the whole bowl. Every once in a while, no problem. But what can happen with eating disorders, especially, is we might notice like I overate, and that might lead to a binge. So what we really want to do is just really start eating more with awareness, if that's available to us and not too overwhelming. We also want to work on mindfulness because it really helps us to be non judgmental and describe things with just the facts, which can be incredibly useful when we're doing things like describing our bodies or defining our behaviors, where we tend to add a lot of judgment, right? We might use words like fat or that we're lazy, or define our behaviors as stupid or bad. And those things are all in the eye of the perceiver, right? Someone else might view our body or view our behaviors and describe them differently. And so mindfulness is about really sticking to the facts, which really can help reduce the intensity of our emotions. The next piece, and the reason mindfulness can be so helpful with eating disorders, is because it can help us understand what's triggering our eating disorder behaviors. A lot of people say, it just happened. I just had the urge to restrict, or I had the urge to do this thing, or I just did it and I have no idea why, or I don't know where it came from. And that in itself is distressing to not understand and not know why. And so mindfulness can help us understand that. And then importantly, a really key part of mindfulness is choosing the effective path. So being able to say, here are my goals in the long term, here are the steps that I need to kind of get there, and being able to choose steps in our lives that are going to bring us closer to our goal, to do what's needed, what's helpful, what's skillful in the moment. And mindfulness can really assist us in figuring out what those things are and kind of connecting to, we call it like the wise part of yourself, the part that knows what skills are really going to be helpful here. So those are so many reasons why mindfulness is helpful in regards to eating disorders. There's lots of other reasons too that will be covered in the group, but that's just a snippet, my kind of top 5. The next part is, or the next set of skills is distress tolerance. So this is really a set of skills that's about tolerating intense emotions without engaging in behaviors that make the situation worse. So sometimes we have really intense emotions, and usually in service of trying to make ourselves feel better, we might do something like lash out or engage in self-harm or purge or other behaviors that really end up causing more problems in the long run, or might kind of lead to a domino effect. And so it's really about how do we tolerate intense emotions and cope with them, using skills and strategies that don't have negative long-term consequences. It's also about, how can I reduce my emotional intensity from, a 9 out of 10 to a 6 out of 10 in seconds to minutes, making everything more manageable. This set of skills is also about soothing ourselves when things are hard. It's about how to make the moment better when it feels like the moment can't be any better. How do we cope with situations we can't change? I think we can all probably think of scenarios in our lives that we wish were different, that we desperately want to be different, and yet we can't do anything about them. So, how do we cope with those situations? And how do we accept them, the fact that they're actually happening? And then what do we do when we don't want to do the effective thing? So we know what we need to do. We know what would be helpful and what would be skillful, but we're just not really willing to do it, right? I think that happens to the best of us. So what do we do when that's the case? So again, why does this matter with eating disorders? First, because it really is about how to cope with urges without turning to eating disorder behaviors. These are really key skills, right? Especially at the beginning of recovery, the urges are still going to be there. So the question is, how do we cope with those urges and not actually engage in the behavior that we've probably turned to for a long time? How do we break that pattern? And how do we deal with whatever's left? It's also about, how do we soothe ourselves or improve the moment when challenging our eating disorder behaviors? Because it's hard work, right? I'm sure everyone who's tried it knows, right? It's a lot of work. And sometimes the best thing to challenge our eating disorder is to do the very opposite of what we want to do, things that make us feel unsafe, that make us feel really anxious and scared. And so when that happens, we want tools in our toolkit to help be able to soothe ourselves, to be able to kind of reward ourselves, to feel a little bit better in that moment when we're doing such a hard thing. Distress tolerance skills are also relevant because it's really about accepting our situations, and accepting our bodies, which is really hard work. and something we often don't really want to do. But how can we accept the body we're in right now and not have it trigger so many negative emotions for us? And then lastly, how do we counter our eating disorder? I know I have this little picture of a woman here at the bottom with her arms crossed. And I think that's like the perfect image to sum this up, because sometimes our eating disorders really don't want us to do what's effective, right? They wanted us to do things that fit with the eating disorder agenda. And recovery is the total opposite. And so the eating disorder often kind of will scream, right? And tell us what we shouldn't do or what we should do. And so the question is, how do we counter that when we know what we should do, but we have this voice inside us telling us that we shouldn't do it, that we should step away? So distress tolerance skills are very useful for eating disorders, but as well, if you ever feel overwhelmed by emotion or you're struggling with things like substance use or self-harm, or other kind of behaviors that you find come up a lot when you have intense emotion, this is a really useful set of skills for you. Okay. Next, we have emotion regulation. So emotion regulation is really the ability to impact what emotions we have, when we have them, how we experience or express them. So it kind of exists on a continuum where, on the one hand, we have emotion regulation, and then on the other end of the spectrum, we have emotion dysregulation, which is really, emotion dysregulation would be what I talked about at the very beginning of this talk, where emotions come, they are big, they feel overwhelming, and we don't know what to do. So, motion regulation skills are really about shifting us down the continuum away from dysregulation and towards regulation. So, part of that is really learning to understand emotions, right? We've probably all had that moment in our lives, or many moments, where we have said, I wish I couldn't feel anxious. I wish I didn't have the ability to feel sad or shame or anger. Because I get that, right? It's uncomfortable. Sometimes we wish that those emotions didn't exist. But really, as part of emotion regulation, we want to learn, why are we having those emotions? What are they communicating to us? So we can try and build some empathy and compassion for them and really learn to say, this is telling me something. So rather than just trying to get rid of it or being upset about it, recognizing what the purpose is of emotion. We also want to learn how to name emotions. A lot of us might say, I just feel bad. I don't know what emotion this is, but I feel bad or I feel upset. Um, it's really common as well, if you have an eating disorder, to say, I feel fat. And as I kind of joke with my clients, fat's not an emotion, but it's, that's a valid experience. So let's try and figure out, what's underneath that. What emotion does that represent? So then we teach a set of skills about, okay, you have an emotion you don't want. How do you change that? What do you do with that? What can you do? And then how do we kind of use skills to reduce the frequency of those emotions happening in the first place? And then as well, how do we increase the positive emotions in our life in the short and the long term and really make our life worth living? And how do we plan ahead for difficult situations? So if we know we have something coming up that's going to be, tough, like a difficult conversation or, a family dinner or a presentation, how do we plan ahead and cope so that we feel skillful and ready to handle that situation when it arises? So emotion regulation is so key for everyone. But research also consistently shows that eating disorders often are accompanied by difficulty regulating emotions. And so this is a really key set of skills. So if you're finding you don't know what to do with emotions, you find them overwhelming, you fear them, this is really a good module, a good set of skills for you to gain. Because that's an exhausting experience, to be overwhelmed by emotion. And so learning how to regulate them can really change your quality of life. As well, we know that, eating disorders tend to be associated with a lot of negative emotions, a lot of anxiety or shame or sadness, and not a lot of positive emotions. And when we go through life like that, really mostly having negative emotions, we can't really build up any resilience to kind of cope with other things that just come along as part of life that are hard. And so this module is about how can we incorporate more positive things into your life so that you have more, emotions like happiness or kind of joy or excitement that come along, so that it's easier to get through the day. Another piece and reason that emotion regulation is so relevant is because part of the skills are about, kind of figuring out what you value and who you are. And eating disorders are often accompanied, or I should say, kind of take control of our lives, where really that's what we focus on. It's something we're thinking about so many times throughout the day. People often say, who I am, my sense of self-worth is really conditioned on my shape or my weight or my eating behaviors. And so it's really about how do we figure out who we are outside of the eating disorder, because everyone is so much more than their eating disorder. And we want to figure out, who are you, what do you value, and how can we, help you build the life that you want and that's meaningful to you. And then lastly, emotion regulation is really relevant because it's, so much of the time we have worry about how to cope with current situations, and that's so often, especially with eating disorders, it might be around holidays. How do I cope with Thanksgiving and the food, or going home to see my family, or how do I cope with, going on a date with someone, or how do I cope with going to the beach or going to the doctor? Just different things that might bring up a lot of anxiety. And so we teach a set of skills that really helps to prepare for those things, and that makes a big difference as well, where we don't feel so fearful all the time and we can feel a sense of mastery. So that's the emotion regulation piece. I think it's really relevant to eating disorders. If you connected with this at all, know that you're not alone in that. This is a really common thing to struggle with. Okay, the last set of skills that we teach is called interpersonal effectiveness. So this is about being skillful in getting what you want and need from others. So basically being able to ask for things you need and to set boundaries and to say no, which can be tricky. And it's about, how do we ask for things or set boundaries in a way that helps us meet our goals or objective in the situation, but also maintains our relationships and maintains our self-respect. Because often what people find is they're usually prioritizing the same thing over and over. So some people might only prioritize the relationship, doesn't matter if they don't get their needs met, they just want their relationship to thrive. Other people, consistently might, highlight their objectives and they don't care about, or they're not really worried about what happens to their relationship. Some people never prioritize their self-respect, so they end up feeling quite bad about themselves a lot of the time. So it's about how do you balance all three of those things and consider all three of those things in your interpersonal interactions. And also, how intensely do we ask for things or say no? How much do I push? How much do I hold back? Because that in itself is an art. I will note as well, even if you think, I'm really skillful in interpersonal interactions, I know what to do. The skills we teach are incredibly helpful. I think I use the skills from this module every day, and I think they'd be useful for everyone. So just something to keep in mind. But why does this matter with eating disorders? So don't be fooled by just the 2 bullet points on this slide. I think it's almost just as important as the other skills as well. So research does suggest that individuals with eating disorders often have difficulty being assertive. So, asking for things, saying no, setting boundaries, and have a greater number of interpersonal problems and anxiety in interpersonal situations. And so this set of skills will really help to do all those things, to be assertive, to handle interpersonal problems, to kind of reduce anxiety about interpersonal situations. And it also helps us to express our hurt. I think a really common thing that we do is we're hurt by something someone did, and instead of bringing it up to them, because that can be uncomfortable, we just kind of push it down. And over time, that hurt builds up and builds up and builds up. And what we tend to see is that relationships either kind of blow up and there's a big fight, or people just end their relationships, whether that be familial or friends or partners, because it's so painful and they're not getting their needs met. So we really want to work to bring those things up earlier, repair kind of relationship ruptures, being able to kind of set boundaries and ask people for what they need or what you need, so that interpersonal relationships thrive. So, kind of in summary of all those skills, right, we have mindfulness skills that are going to be really important and really do form the foundation of a lot of the other skills that we teach. We're going to learn about tolerating our distress. We're going to learn about emotion regulation and interpersonal effectiveness skills. And all four of these components are really important and very useful with eating disorders. And if you have any questions about this at the end, I'd be happy to chat more about, how else these could apply to eating disorder symptoms or just kind of other diagnoses that might be relevant. So those are the skills. We've kind of talked through that. But now let's kind of talk about, how do you learn them? How do we kind of teach these skills to you? How do you gain access to them? So one way is through skills group, and that's what we're going to do. So I just encourage you all, if you haven't done group therapy before, your only reference for group therapy is going to be from the movies or from TV. So I encourage you all just to take a minute and just think of, what does group therapy look like in the movies, right? See if you can conjure that up in your mind. For me, I automatically think this, right? People are all sitting in a circle. There's usually like bad coffee, some stale donuts. Everyone's kind of introducing themselves. It's very supportive. What's shown is often kind of AA or Narcotics Anonymous in movies. And so I'm glad, if you had this thought, you're not alone. This is what I was thinking too. But I really want you to just kind of throw it out because that's not what group therapy looks like, at least in DBT. What it really looks like is this, where it is more of a classroom-based environment. I mean, of course, during COVID, what we're doing is the groups are all on Zoom. But it really is about learning the skills. It's, we have group discussion, we kind of teach the skills, we have, workbooks and homework. And it really is about delivering the skills and in a supportive sort of way. And so there's still room for that relationship formation, that feeling of validation and support, all within the context of really a classroom. So skills group itself is 2 hours and it happens on a weekly basis. And so in each skills group, there are 10 people, 10 clients or participants, and 2 co-facilitators. So for example, it might be, myself and somebody else. In the course of, or in the case, I should say, of Skills for Recovery, it'll be Dr. Jennifer Bartlett, who has a lot of expertise in both DBT and eating disorders. So kind of the perfect mix for this group. And then a fellow PhD student at Dalhousie University who also has experience in DBT and eating disorders. So there'll be 2 of them there. And what they'll do is they'll each take 1 hour or 1/2 of the group. And one of them will be leading and the other one will be kind of observing the group and making sure it functions well. The reason that we have this extra person is because we know, group can be overwhelming. You haven't learned the skills to regulate your emotions or tolerate your distress. And so you might have those strong emotions come up in session. And if you've ever tried to learn something in that context or pay attention to something while you have intense emotion, it's pretty hard. So the other group facilitator is there in case you would like some help using skills, learning in the moment about how to deal with your emotions. So we go to a breakout room on Zoom. We can show you how to use a skill so that you can quickly regulate and get back to group. It's also nice to have 2 co-facilitators because they both have different knowledge and different experiences that they can bring to the table. So in terms of structure, skills group is extremely predictable. It is the same every week. So we always start with a mindfulness activity. This is, I guess, for a couple of reasons. One, because mindfulness skills are really important, it helps you continue to grow your mindfulness skills even in the weeks when we're not teaching them. So you can practice every single week. It also helps you gain exposure to different types of mindfulness activities. So really about, how can I gain experience with different things, learn what I like, what I don't like, learn what my strengths are and what my weaknesses are. And then it also really allows us to kind of transition into group because we are all coming from somewhere else. We might have just, cooked dinner for our kids or something, or we might have just, come from work. And so it's a great opportunity to kind of just allow ourselves to be grounded and recognize that we're now moving into group. The next thing we always do is a skill review. So, whatever we learned the week before, we quickly kind of cover again for a refresher. So, if you are in the group and you've learned it the week before, we'll get you to kind of teach it back to us. We might say, last week we learned a skill. Who remembers what that was? Then someone would tell us. And then we might say, well, what was the main take home point about that skill? Or when should we use it? Someone might tell us. And the reason for that is because we know for learning and for memory that repetition is really key, right? When we hear things more than once, we're much more likely to remember that and get it into our brains. Then we spend some time doing homework review. So each week you have homework. So whatever skill we learned, we assign you homework to go practice that skill at home. And so the main reason for this is because, if you're coming to DBT for recovery, the skills group, if you're willing to put in all this time and all this effort, it must mean that you really want to change something. And the way that you're going to change something in your lives, work on eating disorder recovery, is by practicing the skills outside of group. Group is great, but it's only 2 hours in a 168-hour week. So the real change is going to happen in that other 166 hours. And so we really encourage you to practice. And assigning homework is really incentive to help you do that. The other piece is, when you learn something in a classroom, it can be entirely different from actually trying that out in real life. So, if I put up a whiteboard here and I started telling you about how to ride a bicycle and gave you a lecture about that, and then I sent you home with a bicycle and said, go ride it. The first time you get on that bicycle, it might be a little rough because it's totally different than what I talked about in the classroom. So this gives us a chance, if you try the skill and it doesn't work, to bring it back and to get some feedback from us to say, this part worked, but this part didn't, and we can, help you troubleshoot. Alternatively, if it went really well, we can kind of celebrate that and be really thrilled for you. So homework is a really key component. It is expected. In this group, we are teaching a lot of skills because we want you to really leave with as many tools as you can and have in your toolkit. And so while group is 2 hours a week, there's probably I'd say an hour of homework that you'll be expected to do outside of the group. So when you're thinking about whether you want to commit to this, I would definitely budget for at least another hour. Although a lot of the skills practice will also come just kind of automatically or consciously as you're going about your daily lives. Then I should say before I do that the homework review is about 3 minutes a person. So you're not expected to, tell us your life story about that week. But we do want you to share. So if you feel uncomfortable sharing with people you don't know, I get that. So what we'd say is, practice it in your life in the areas you really want to work on. And then also practice it in your life in an area that you'd be willing to talk about with the group and choose that example to share. So that we can really give you feedback because that's really helpful. And you might find as well, as you go through the weeks of the group, you'll get much more comfortable with others and be more open to sharing. Okay, then we take a break. We take a 10-minute break to give you a break from Zoom fatigue because being on Zoom for 2 hours can be tricky. But also to just give you a chance to, regulate if you need to. You want to go pet your dog or play video games or have a snack or a glass of water. Or if you want to just hang out and connect with some people. I know the pandemic is very isolating. So can we connect with other people who are experiencing the same thing and just chat? That's also a possibility. And then we come back. We learn some new skills. So we'll teach a skill or a set of skills, and then we'll assign homework. So as part of this, what you'll get is a workbook where you'll have all of the materials that we teach come with a handout so you can follow along, take notes, so you have it to refer back to later. And then there's also worksheets that come with it that kind of guide you through exactly how to use the skill. So that's the group. There's it's common to have a lot of fears about group therapy if you've never done it before. Probably the most common ones are, no one will have the same problems that I do. I'll be judged by the other people there, or I'll say something stupid. And so, just looking at the first one I had up there, no one will have the same problems that I do. I think group therapy is actually a great way to kind of find out that a lot of people actually do have the same problems that you do. Everyone's slightly different, but a lot of people are experiencing the same struggles. And having a group to recognize that, to really meet with those people, is really something that really validates the experience and is very supportive. If you've done any of the kind of peer support that Eating Disorders Nova Scotia offers, you probably have had this experience, and that transfers to group therapy as well. The other fear is, I'll say something stupid, I'll be judged by other people. Talking to people, I really find this isn't their experience in group. They don't feel judged, they feel supported. And since we're working so hard on mindfulness and being non-judgmental, I think this is the perfect opportunity to practice that and for others to live it out as well. Okay, so that is kind of the DBT spiel that I have. Before I take questions, I just want to touch on the Skills for Recovery group in terms of logistics, and kind of what it's going to look like so that you have that information. So just first, how do I know if this group is right for me? Because finding you the right treatment is really important. I'd say, number one, if you want to start working on your eating disorder and you're having difficulty with any of these things, staying in the present moment, being non-judgmental towards yourself or others, regulating your emotions, tolerating your distress, accepting things in your life, kind of coping with urges related to eating disorder, or being effective in interpersonal relationships, this is probably a good group for you. So if you connected to any of the things I said, I think you're in the right spot. But we want to make sure that we're checking in with everyone to ensure that this is actually the right fit for you. So when you do want to sign up, we'll have a chat with you, or a member of our team will have a chat with you to make sure that this is actually the right group for you. And if it's not, we'll kind of let you know your options. Of course, if you really want to, you can always participate, but letting you know what other options are out there so that you are being connected with the thing that's most likely to be effective for you and to meet your goals. Okay, so the actual group is 13 weeks. So it'll be on Tuesdays, and it'll be from 6:30 to 8:30 p.m. It'll be on Zoom, like I mentioned. The cost is $1,170, which works out to $90 for every 2-hour group. So just to put that into perspective, right? Seeing a psychologist is typically $180, $190 an hour. So individual session for 2 hours with a psychologist would be $360 versus the $90 for the group. So it is really the best bang for your buck, to say that. And then it's $30 for the workbook that we send you that'll be electronic with all of the pages and so on. So psychology will be on the receipt. So if you have insurance, I really encourage you to ask if you are eligible for group therapy to be reimbursed for that, or psychology. And so how to sign up. So if you can pay the full price for the group, the $1,200, you can just directly contact Lesley Hartman and Associates. So you can email intake@lesleyhartman. But the great thing about partnering with Eating Disorders Nova Scotia is that they have some bursaries where they can pay, 25 to 75% of the cost can be covered if you can't afford it. So what you do is you fill out an Eating Disorders Nova Scotia bursary form, and Raquel has access to that, and she's kind of, I think, in charge of that. So she'll be able to touch on that if you have questions. And then we'll be in touch with you through Eating Disorders Nova Scotia, is my understanding. So if you really think that this is a good fit for you, and you can pay up front, you can contact directly. But if you can't, then you can contact Eating Disorder Nova Scotia. Okay, I know everyone is, oh, I should say there's lots of homework. I already said that. Just be, if you're willing to sign up, just notice if you're willing to commit to that homework. Um, Now it's time for some questions. I know you have heard my voice for a long time this evening. You're all probably ready for a break. I'm probably ready for one too. So if there's any questions, feel free to pipe up, or I don't know, for Cal, if you have any that are in the chat box. But now is a great time. And then when we're finished with questions, we'll move on to teaching the skill.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. Thanks for going through all that with us and giving us a good idea too of like what group actually looks like. And just to remind folks, in the PDF welcome package that you received, like that had the Zoom details to access the info session tonight, it has information like that same logistical stuff that Sarah just went over about the group. So the cost, when it's happening, um, how to, like, what number to call at Lesley, Hartman and Associates, and what to say if you're interested in this group. The bursary form is linked right into that. So if that is a financial barrier for you and you want to still attend, to fill out that form. Our organization is kind of subsidizing a certain amount of spots for the group. So there's kind of a range of bursaries that are available. So say if you're able to pay like 25% or 50% or 75%. So there is a range of kind of options there. So that form is linked right into that same welcome package as well. So everything that you need to know should be in there. But yeah, there was just one question that came up so far. Someone specifically was asking about if you have any experience using DBT for avoidant restrictive food intake disorder. So if folks haven't heard of that before, it's kind of it's a newer eating disorder. Definitely one of the ones that doesn't get as much airtime as anorexia or bulimia or binge eating disorder. So Sarah, do you have kind of a response to that?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So thank you for whoever brought that up. So I know ARFID can look, really different. At least the criteria in the DSM that we use to diagnose eating disorders has, a really wide range of things that can make up ARFID. So I think it kind of depends on the particulars of your symptoms. But I think if you kind of connected to any of these things, that's really useful. There is a kind of skill in DBT that's really about, challenging the things that we're avoiding, which we're going to teach, which is of course really relevant to ARFID. What I do know as well is the evidence in terms of research. I know I didn't touch on that a lot at the beginning about what's the most evidence-based treatment, but for ARFID, I believe it's also CBT. So that would be kind of the first line intervention. If you're looking to really kind of kick the ARFID in the butt, then maybe that would be the way to go, versus if you think you're just kind of want to slide into things and you really feel like you're having big emotions, you're struggling in interpersonal situations, you're kind of having difficulty tolerating urges for other things or ARFID urges, then it would be relevant for you. I hope that kind of gives you a bit of a sense.
Yeah, I think especially, I think the last slide that you had up, Sarah, where it's like, are you struggling with kind of any of these things? I think that that's like a really helpful kind of nutshell of, because obviously we just went over like lots of different, information, but if you're still kind of thinking like, okay, but is this for me at the end of the day? I think it's really helpful to look at that slide in particular to say like, okay, yes, I struggle with some of those things. This group might be a good fit for me.
And I think
Um,
too, Rick, I'll just jump in, right? If you're really still kind of not sure, I mean, that's okay. That makes sense. And when you contact intake, like I said, they're going to try and figure out what's the best for you. So our intake staff is also trained to figure out, there's another program called Radically Open DBT, which is really useful for some eating disorders as well. And there's standard DBT, and then there's other programs. So they'll have you probably fill out some questionnaires, or they'll ask you some questions to help you navigate this system, because if you're not an expert, right, why would you be? And so, you can come to them and they'll be able to kind of help you navigate that.
There was kind of a question about, is it possible to get just the workbook? Or if not, like, is there maybe a DBT workbook that you would recommend that folks could, access?
I'm not sure about just the workbook. I can absolutely check. So if you want to just either, my contact information is going to be at the very end. So if you want to email me, I can check. The other thing that I'd recommend that may be more helpful than that, because the worksheets are great, but they're really augmented a lot by the teaching, is if it's for someone who's experiencing kind of binge eating or bulimia. There's a really fantastic DBT workbook for binge eating and bulimia. I think it was actually in the welcome package. Maybe Raquel, you can maybe clarify that for me. I think it was. We listed it in the welcome package.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, the dialectical behavior therapy skills workbook for bulimia is linked right in there. And
Yeah.
there's a linked free workbook for disordered eating as well. It's not specific to DBT, but still has a lot of useful info in there from the Center for Clinical Intervention. So those are both linked in the welcome package, as well as some handouts from this skill that Sarah is going to go over in a couple minutes with us.
Yeah, so I'd recommend that book as well. Just like Raquel said, the Center for Clinical Interventions, the CCI one that I've put in there, is CBT based. It's free, it's online, it's evidence based. There's a lot of kind of worksheets and psychoeducation, which I'd recommend as well. And then, really, if you feel like you're struggling with a lot of the things I mentioned outside of an eating disorder, then kind of any DBT skills workbook that's available online would also be really helpful, as long as it's kind of guided and gives you some help in terms of figuring out what the skills are.
This is a good question. Is there a big difference between this skills group in March and a regular or standard, I'm assuming, standard DBT group therapy? Would it be a good starting point to eventually getting individual therapy?
Yeah, so I think that's kind of a two-part question. In terms of the first piece, so this group is 13 weeks and it includes, all four of those skills. Standard DBT has three different groups that we do. And so they're either 8 weeks or 9 weeks, and they're focused on one particular skill. So they're focused either on emotion regulation, distress tolerance, or interpersonal effectiveness. And then mindfulness is part of those three groups. So standard DBT group would be 6 months. We just divide it into three chunks, but it's 6 months versus this is 13 weeks. So it's really it delves deeper into those skills. And then in terms of individual, I think, yeah, absolutely, right? If you want to really learn some skills to prepare you for individual therapy, whether it's on about eating disorders, I'd say absolutely, because we really, when we do individual eating disorder treatment, say, okay, are you ready to throw yourself into the deep end to face anxiety right away? And if you have skills in your toolbox that you've learned from DBT group about how to cope with that, I think it's going to be kind of easier, more manageable. And if you want to start individual therapy about, something totally related, then, I think it depends. These skills are useful for life and for anyone, I think. But if you want specific individual therapy, for trauma or something like that, it may be best to kind of just jump right into that individual treatment. Raquel, I don't know if we have any other questions, but I'm wondering if we can jump to the skill teaching and then maybe jump back to questions in case people have to leave right at 8:30.
Yeah, that's a good idea. We can do that.
Okay. All right. So this skill that I'm going to teach is actually in the package that we sent out, all kind of condensed as a PDF. So you could actually print it out if you wanted to use it. So this is a set of DBT skills. I'm kind of pulling from all the modules except interpersonal effectiveness to really help deal with eating disorder urges. So urges like binging or purging or exercise or whatever it is for you. So whenever we have an urge, this is going to be a set of skills or a set of steps that we can do to help cope with it that really helps us not engage in the behavior. So if you're committed to kind of stopping the eating disorder behaviors, then this is a really good place to start. So, the first thing we want to do when we notice an urge is literally to stop, freeze, and just kind of take a step back from the situation if you can. So, if I'm having an urge to binge and I'm in the kitchen, taking a step back would look like getting the heck out of the kitchen. If I was, standing in my room and it happened, I might take a step back just mentally, kind of saying, like, whoa, hold on a second. And what I'm going to do next is just kind of observe the urge that's in our body to do the behavior and then choose to proceed with skills. So, what this really means is we stop, we take a step back, and we say, okay, I'm noticing this urge and I'm not going to do the behavior. I'm going to be skillful instead. The next step is to set a timer. And it sounds basic, but grab a phone, grab the oven timer, whatever it is, set a timer for 15 minutes and commit to not doing whatever behavior you want to do for 15 minutes. What research shows us is that urges often dissipate before 15 minutes, especially for things like purging and binging. So if you can get through that 15 minutes, the urge probably won't be there anymore. So this is a 15 minutes that you kind of say, I just need to make it through 15 minutes, and I'm going to be skillful and use other skills to help me make it through that 15 minutes during this time and make it through the urge. I think this is really key because a lot of the times when we have an urge, we feel like I have to act on this or else it's never going to go away. But that actually isn't true. If we just ride it out, it'll go away by itself. So once we've done that, we've stopped, we've set a timer, we're going to actually do a little bit of distress tolerance skills, trying to calm ourselves a bit because if we're calm, it's so much easier to handle our urges than when our emotions are really intense. It just adds so much complexity, so much difficulty when we have intense emotions. So, we're going to do something called paced breathing. You might have heard this before called belly breathing in yoga. It's also called diaphragmic breathing. And so, what we're going to do is there's a couple of key components. The first is to really start being able to breathe with your belly. So, lots of people breathe through their shoulders, and their shoulders move when they breathe. But what we want to start doing is really taking the breath in and breathing through our belly. So, if you feel comfortable to try this now, just place your hands on your belly and just see if when you can breathe, you can make it so it's like a balloon is expanding under your shirt. So your shoulders aren't going up and down, but your belly is going in and out. If you've had any vocal training, this is probably something that is familiar to you. Otherwise, it might be kind of a foreign feeling. So see if you can do that. The other really key piece is that we're trying to slow down our breath. So aiming for about 5 to 6 breaths per minute. If we're anxious, right, it's going to be hard to breathe at 6 breaths per minute, but we want to kind of slow it down over time, really hoping to get to 6 breaths per minute or 5 breaths per minute total. And then the most important part of this is we want to make sure we are breathing out for longer than we're breathing in. So, what happens when we breathe in is it activates our sympathetic nervous system, our fight or flight system, right? That system that prepares us, when we see a bear to fight or run. And so it's the part that really accelerates our heart rate. And it comes when we're distressed, that system is really active. But when we breathe out, it activates our sympathetic or our parasympathetic nervous system, which is the rest and digest system, that calming system. So if we can breathe out for longer than we're breathing in, that means that our calming system is active for more time than that really active system, that activating system. So it will calm us down just based on biology. We don't have to do anything as long as we're breathing out more than we're breathing in, or for longer than we're breathing in. So doing that for a couple of minutes, just really focusing on breathing, really focusing on counting, breathing in for 4 and out for 6 and counting that really helps to reduce our emotional intensity, lower our heart rate, and it helps us to be more prepared to manage these urges that we're experiencing. So after we've done that, we want to go to the next step, which is about reviewing pros and cons. So if the urge isn't really overpowering and we feel like we can sit with it for a bit, we want to remind ourselves of why the behavior is an effective choice. So, why are we working so hard for this? Why do we want to stop? And what we want to do is make sure we're creating this pros and cons list ahead of time when we're in a calm state, a wise state. Because if I'm doing a pros and cons list when I really want to do a behavior, it's going to be pretty skewed towards that behavior. So, being able to kind of do this at another time. So, specifically, we want to make this kind of fancy pros and cons that we call a decisional balance. So, where you have pros and cons of both doing the behavior and also not doing the behavior. And so this allows us to kind of shift our perspective and come up with more reasons kind of for or against a behavior by being able to see it in a slightly different way. So a lot of people say, okay, if I'm doing this for binging, aren't the pros of binging the same as the cons of not binging? Isn't that just kind of the flip side? So if the pro of binging is, emotional release, then not doing the behavior, the con would be I don't get emotional release. Very true. The diagonals sometimes have really similar pros and cons. But what I will say is that people often find there are at least a couple of things that they have different in those boxes that they maybe wouldn't have thought of if they just did pros and cons normally. So I encourage you to do this in advance, kind of work on it, return to it, add to it, and then keep it somewhere that's accessible. Like put it in your phone, right? That's going to be something that you usually have with you. And so, in a pinch, when this urge comes up and you've taken a step back, you've set the timer, you've done your breathing, you can look at it and remind yourself, why am I committing to this? Why am I working so hard? Then, lastly, we want to distract. So, at this point, there's still probably some minutes left on our timer. And we don't need to just sit with that urge. We can throw ourselves into something else, specifically an activity that's going to take up our attention and is incompatible with whatever behavior we're trying not to do. So, for example, if I have an urge to binge or purge, I'm not going to go hang out in the kitchen and have a snack, right? Instead, what I'm going to do is something that's incompatible with that, which would be, painting my nails, because it's hard to do a lot of things with wet nails, calling a friend, taking a hot or cold shower, going for a walk and not bringing my credit card so I can't, buy any food. So really working to kind of throw ourselves into something. And what we usually find is by the end of the 15 minutes when that timer goes off, we've kind of forgotten about it. And the urge is gone because we've thrown ourselves into something else and done all of that other work. So really what we want to do, like I said, is stop and take that step back, really commit to not doing the behavior, setting that timer, doing the breathing to really use biology to calm us down, going through those pros and cons, and then distracting. So this is a really useful skill for lots of other urges you might have as well, if self-harm or substance use or other behaviors or skin picking is a concern for you, all applicable to this skill as well. All right. I know we're out of time. I'm 1 minute over the mark. So I know you can feel free to jump off the call if you're done. But as well, I have my contact information up here. So if you have any questions, you can email me, but I'll also kind of hang around. So if you have any remaining questions, feel free to stay.
There's a couple of really interesting questions I'd love to ask for anyone who wants to stick around. Again, totally fine if you need to leave. But where did it go? So someone says, I'm trying to wrap my mind around the concept of unconditional permission to eat, intuitive eating in brackets, intersecting with binging urge management, i.e., not eating unconditionally, i.e., not engaging in binge eating disorder behavior. Any thoughts?
That is such a good question. And it's so hard, right? Because on the one hand, we're saying, like, when I have this kind of feeling that I want to eat, then we're teaching you intuitive eating to go for it. But on the other hand, I'm over here saying, like, when you have the urge to binge, try and stop. And so, yeah, that's kind of a funny, almost a dialectic in itself. And I think when we think about that, what we really want to do is like intuitive eating is different from binging, right? Binging is eating like way past the point where we're full, and that's not kind of following what our body really needs, like nutritionally and energy wise. So I think it's about, noticing when we're high risk for binging and choosing to use skills then. And then once that urge goes away, making sure that we are following that intuitive part and making sure that we do have a snack, that it's not now I don't eat for the rest of the day or however long. It's that, okay, I'm hungry, I'm going to do it, but let's do it at a low risk time and when it's not
Mhm.
likely to lead to those behaviors. If that makes sense.
Yeah, and the unconditional permission to eat aspect kind of comes from trying to like liberate ourselves from food rules because there often is a restriction component of some sort, like with binge eating disorder as well. So I like that kind of like philosophy of permission, I think is kind of specifically speaking to that aspect of disordered eating as well. But yeah, that's also a really helpful point too, Sarah. And someone also asked, I think this was in specifically, I think this was specifically when you were going through the skill, but they said advice if that behavior is restriction, because I
Mm,
know it's a little bit easier, I think, sometimes for us to use purging or binging as an example of like not to engage in that behavior because I don't know, restriction is harder for us to identify sometimes as a behavior that we're engaging in because it's like we think it's like a lack of behavior. You know what I mean? So like, what would you say to that?
Yeah, so I'm just going to go back a slide here if I can. That is such a good question. And I think we just modify the skill. Restricting still comes with urges, right? Even if we don't sometimes notice them that much, there is the urge to restrict. And so when you notice that urge, or you notice, like, hey, I have been restricting today or this week or whenever, it's same thing applies. Stop, kind of take a step back and say, like, whoa, this is happening for me, kind of taking a minute to recognize that. And then rather than kind of setting a timer, you still do that commitment piece. Like, I'm going to commit to not restrict. And then it's really about, like, maybe you need to do the idea of that is distressing. Maybe you need to do breathing to kind of motivate yourself or kind of get the confidence and the ability to go kind of challenge that urge. Maybe you still do pros and cons, right? Choosing not to restrict is hard. So, what are the reasons that I'm trying so hard to work on this behavior? And then instead of really distracting ourselves so we don't do the behavior, it's about, I'm committed to going to the kitchen right now and making that choice to eat. So it still is about, noticing the urge, making the commitment, tolerating our distress, learning why, reminding ourselves of the pros and cons. But then the end of the skill is, hey, let's go to the kitchen right now. And maybe we set a timer and say, I have to eat in 15 minutes. Maybe it's the total opposite. But those kind of parts of the skill still apply, if that makes sense.
And the last question I'll ask is, at what stage of recovery is it best to start DBT?
Ooh, that's a good question. I think any stage, really, as long as I think you're willing and to work on it, and you're medically stable, would be the time where you want to start it. I think if you've done treatment already, maybe you've been through CBT and you're ready for something different, it's a good try. If you haven't ever done treatment before, this is a good thing to try as well. The only thing I would say, like, if you're in the stage of recovery where you're just totally, we call it like green light, like you're ready to go, you're ready to tackle it 100%. Again, like that's another time to consider CBT for eating disorders to kind of really knock that out of the park.
Yeah, and theoretically too, Sarah, like when folks connect with intake at Lesley Hartman and Associates to have that brief intake done on the phone to make sure that the group is going to suit that person's needs. Theoretically, they wouldn't be, admitting people to the group if they thought like it really wasn't appropriate or that, that's not a good fit for that person at that time.
Yeah, exactly, right? Like, our goal is to help you meet your needs and to give you the treatment that works best for you. Even ethically, like, we're bound by that and we want to abide by that too because we know it's so valuable. So if you're not sure, like I said, just get in touch with us and we'll help you figure out how to navigate that so that you do land in the right spot.
Mm. And quick tip I have for folks on the whole breathing aspect of that skill is something I have found really useful if you're having a hard time noticing where your breath is lying and if you are using like your diaphragm to breathe is to lay on the floor on your back and place your hands on your belly. For some reason, like, it's a lot more noticeable to, like, have an awareness of, like, where the air is and how it's deflating, that kind of thing. Thanks to folks for your questions and for the folks that stuck around to ask those questions too. That's really awesome to see you folks do that. And Sarah, thank you so much for explaining what DBT is, and especially for like providing so many examples of like what it might look like with eating disorders, and like what skills might be useful for disorder eating behaviors, and really showing like what that could look like. So thank you so much for doing that, and thanks folks again for being here, and make sure you check out that welcome package and all the details and info in there, and best wishes for the rest of your evening. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks everyone.